some something to take from this presentation and from some of my stories as well in this sea that I was born in. Is it possible, Professor Kauk, to share the screen? I have
Certainly.
a
Let
little.
me just enable the
I,
share screen.
yes, I have a few images that will accompany the paper. Thank you.
Just one sec.
Maybe I've sent a request. Maybe that will make things
Yes,
easier.
that's better. You should be able to share. Can you share?
Yes. Oh, okay, let's hope it will let me share.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, are you seeing the sort of, does it?
Yes. We can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So, as a young boy in the 1980s, I would spend many weeks down by the sea, whiling the days away, reading, swimming, and chatting with my mom and her friends. Besides its graceful Odyssean looks, Arlapsi, the picturesque inlet on Malta's southwestern coast, almost always gave me the vertiginous sense of standing on the high bow of a becalmed ship. I'd spend many reading hours there, on the bay's outlying rocks, yearning to set out across that quivering, shimmering stretch of lapis lazuli blue. And I'd often mull over the arcane language of the wavelets as they broke against my shins and sent patches of foam floating out onto the water. During one of those long summer stints, I have a clear memory of having heard the national radio newscaster earlier that morning describe the sea, my sea, as Malta's territorial waters. But how can the sea be territorial? I remember asking Mum later that evening. How can this be if the water can't even resist itself, if it keeps merging and spilling over all the time into the waters of the many other countries that surround ours? Or has it indeed had some change of heart and decided it should suddenly become territorial? My conundrum did not heal as I grew older. It only turned worse, in fact. Signs of the imprint of that continuum of water across territories that were invisible to my naked eye abounded. With the increase in migrant boat crossings in the 1990s, dead human bodies were seen floating at various locations on the island's search and rescue zone, just as human remains were terrifyingly showing up in the nets of Sicilian fishermen following the terrible migrant tragedy of 1996 close to Porto Palo di Capopassero. As time went by, naming the Mediterranean of my childhood, the one that swelled and frothed outside this brutal realm of disquieting flows and surges of human terror, became much harder for me to think of. The language of the sea had unfolded into one of an unsparing reality of debordering, a vast, azure arena across which the overrun of assigned edges and demarcations played out relentlessly against a background of state-sanctioned and other barriers, of migrant pushbacks, and the obscure dialectic of walls erected within hearts as much as within minds. As I eventually acquainted myself with the sprawling map of the literatures of the Mediterranean, and as I experienced that firsthand in Istanbul, in Tunis, in Ramallah, elsewhere, some of the wounding events out of which this literature emerged, I found myself reaffirming the sense of disquietude, this at once exuberant and treacherous character that the sea had implied to me in those early years. From its taciturn, indeterminable and uncontrollable currents noted by Predrag Matrevich, all the way to Massimo Cacciari's allusion to the deep, open or high sea, the atritos, the condition of perpetual disquiet of the sea. The Mediterranean penchant for opening up moments of mercurial overrun or debordering, as Derrida would word it, stands at the heart of some of the most significant meditations on the Mediterranean that I have read. For Ian Chambers, for example, to write about the Mediterranean outside the circuit of colonial discourse would inevitably demand us to relocate, I quote, in the historical swell of a tempestuous sea. And it is precisely here that I recently encountered, in a wonderful essay by Libyan-American writer Hisham Matar, titled To Know and to Know Not, a certain idea of this historical swell of the tempestuous Mediterranean. In his brief essay, Matar holds forth a subtle critique of those segmentary and divisive agendas that are hogged today as confident geography, as charismatic populist resolve and clarity of vision. From the shores of Gaza to those of Lampedusa, the Mediterranean is of course no stranger to this corrosive anti-politics, to use Giovanni Orsina's phrase. Describing his experience of wearing spectacles for the first time as a child, so he may have his blurred vision corrected, Matar explains his confusion at the incongruity of what he calls this exacting world, with the one he'd believed had grasped prior to having to put on glasses. Clear vision struck me as a corruption, Matar observes, confessing how he had to deal with the violent, hard edge of a sharply inked geopolitics, across which everything and everyone was endowed with distinct contours. I quote, their borders fixed, delineated into a specific terrain, as he puts it. Matar goes on in his essay to contrast this oppressive clarity he finds while wearing his glasses with that intense and liberating pool of color that was the sea as he swam in it before lenses entered his life. Matar, of course, knows more than a thing or two about intransigence, about the impenetrability of power when its intent is nefarious, and the searing violence of silence when wielded as a wall. That dilated sea in which his childhood vision is immersed, in which it paddles uncorrected, speaks to us of those modes of knowing that often take our lives unawares, precisely through their serendipitous accounts of the happening of beauty as much as of tragedy. It is here, in the relentless flow of accident and events that often happen to us unawares, that we identify our own truth of the sea. Matar's joy in the blurry waters of the Mediterranean reminded me of those times in my life when I myself experienced brittle moments when that quivering blue could at any moment turn unannounced into a perilous trembling on the edges of obscurity. A bloated form floating close to the Dorado fishing rafts. The sudden loss of a loved one to unfathomable tragedy. The sea does not merely trespass those defined zones we are well acquainted with. Its tempestuous key, as Chambers puts it, that swell of currents often allow obscured stories to surface, much like the raft of Odysseus as the waves spew it back to the surface just off the Phaeacian shores. The poets of the Mediterranean often remind us that one of the sea's most intimate truths is the comeback of memory itself in the form of accident. The Greek poet George Seferis, perhaps, words it most fluently in his beautiful poem titled Memory One. Memory, Seferis writes, hurts wherever you touch it. This intuiting of life around the sea, as a way of spilling outwards, a scattering of memory fragments, is also worded by Seferis when he is contemplating the ancient ruins at Delphi, the oracle of Pythia at Delphi. Here, Seferis describes the ancient vestiges, I quote, as fragments of a life which was once complete, disturbing fragments, close to us, ours for one moment, and then mysterious and unapproachable as the line of a stone licked smooth by the wave or of a shell in the sea's depths. Close to us one moment, forbidding the next. Seferis' sense at Delphi is of the sea as a restless site of memory, an often discordant one, and yet all the more intimate for that precise reason. My own travels across the Mediterranean have often brought me up against the melancholy restlessness of the sea, of the stories that it keeps spawning, such that in some way it makes memory agents out of those of us who witness them, as J. Winter has put it. But what does it mean for a poet with an aesthetic eye like Seferis to speak of a memory that hurts wherever one touches it? What do we mean to say when we speak of the melancholy restlessness of the Mediterranean? Why does the Mediterranean often come across to us as being organized around a visual grammar of mourning and of loss, as J. Winter has observed, one that is likely to remain the dominant pattern of public remembrance at sites of memory in the foreseeable future? Sociologist and writer Franco Cassano had written the following about the Mediterranean in his essay, The Mediterranean Sea of the Future. One of the reasons for the fascination of the sea lies in the fact that when the morning is clear, the seemingly reduced distance allows you with some emotion to see the other shore. This you can do in Salento in southern Italy. The key is right there. How can we turn this proximity into a great opportunity, a common resource? Cassano asks. His pitch for the Mediterranean as a zone of proximity, the notion, therefore, that the power of the sea somehow lies in the reduced distances it affords those living and writing across its shores, has intrigued many of us. It comes, of course, with a dark underbelly. One of the reasons for that melancholy restlessness or disquiet of the sea is precisely our knowledge that there is no such thing as a purely aesthetic experience in the Mediterranean. The picture-perfect allure of the Cyclades, or the central Mediterranean islands, with their intricate geology and history, must coexist with the arrivals of persons often broken by the experience of flight, of having to run from situations that have made their lives unbearable elsewhere. The sea itself, therefore, may hardly be thought of in terms of the fearsome prowess endowed to it by the Romantics. We now know how vulnerable it has become to human depredations, to overfishing, to resource extraction, transmarine pollution, and human deaths. The Turkish novelist, memoirist, and Nobel laureate Orhan Pamuk, in his memoir Istanbul, which is in many ways a nostalgic paean for his native city, does not only feel melancholy because of the bygone grandeur of the Ottomans and the city's old architecture. He also writes melancholically because of the spectacle for quick fix consumption that spaces like the Bosphorus, the city's dividing waterway, have become. There are many other fascinating, if melancholy takes, on port cities around the Mediterranean, from Andrea Simon in Alexandria, to Assia Jabbar in Algiers, to Hoda Barakat in Beirut. And these make me keep discussing this matter over and over again with my students. Is it enough to speak of melancholy spaces? Or does melancholy itself, as an emotion, begin to take on the features of a complex and sprawling space? One that may harbor all the many stories and events that keep pouring themselves into it. As I toured Argentina's National Art Collection in Buenos Aires a year and a half ago, I found myself in front of a dark realist painting, shown at the deep end of the first room on the museum's ground floor. In this intimate spot hangs Gustave Courbet's Mer Orageuse, The Stormy Sea, which he painted in 1869. This is but one of the variations on the theme authored by Courbet. The scene captures the motion of high waves during a sea storm, under a somewhat portentous sky, their vast expanse of mighty crests coming aslant from a great distance to eventually reach us, as if they're bound to break up in our lap. As I gazed at Courbet's waves, raging at height and yet struggling with an inner sense of wistfulness, it struck me as meaningful that this depiction of turbulent waters pushing their way outwards from the museum should be hanging right here, in the core collection of the Argentinian nation, flowing towards the edges of the River Plate Delta, which in turn opens out onto the Atlantic Ocean. A few days later, I was in conversation with Rafael Felipe Oterinho, one of Argentina's greatest living writers, who was also a friend of Jorge Luis Borges. Oterinho spoke to me about the sense in which his country, Argentina, peopled as it is by generations of migrants from across the Mediterranean, continues to feel today un po' tristona, as he puts it, to harbor a certain deep-seated sense of melancholy. This, he pointed out, is also owing to a consciousness of the Mediterranean feeling from this side of the ocean at once intimate and lejano, as they put it, or far-flung. Yet another poet friend, whose great-grandparents migrated from Italy almost a century ago, described this condition as, I quote, having been pulled away from a mother who is now distant. Following these personal touches, the waves of Courbet's painting, carrying their story from my own across and into my own afar, took on a renewed sense of meaning. The ancient Greeks used various terms to describe the sea. These include the word thalassa, which has a profound maternal connotation. It evokes the Mediterranean as a womb, a matrix that extends across the sea's pathways, and one that denotes a proper name rather than a generic one. But when the sea, as Massimo Cacciari writes, embraces us from every side, when it at once and the same time shelters and threatens us, when it counters our rhythms with the greatest of force, then it assumes another name, Pelagos, the deep or the high open sea. This understanding of the sea as Pelagos again evokes Odysseus' story of his entrapment on the island of Ogygia, one which, in Book 5 of the Odyssey, is an experience described as having sea all around him, sea on every side. But Massimo Cacciari, the Italian geophilosopher, also captures the sense of the high sea as being an unweary or tireless sea, mare infaticabile, which the Greeks spoke of as atritos, unrelentingly tireless. This term captures the deep open or high sea as being in a condition of perpetual disquiet. Yasser el-Hariri and Edwidge Tamalet recently referred to the Mediterranean as, I quote, throbbing with a sense of urgency, crisscrossed with indeterminacy. This experience of a tireless or restless sea is evocatively named in Oterinho's poem Des Horas, After Hours, in which he writes, I quote, The near, the far, two dimensions of the purest contradiction. They affirm, they deny, while stretching the rope that keeps us alive in its weightlessness and its lullaby. Oterinio's elastic geography echoes with the Mediterranean's own opening onto the Atlantic. That agitated point of contact where a certain memory of the Middle Passage meets the Mediterranean purview, the purview of the Middle Sea. For Edouard Glissant, this dimension entails the opening up of regions across national frontiers and the resilience to recompose the world's landscapes. Again, Glissant somewhat echoes Cacciari's view that in the Mediterranean, and I'm quoting Cacciari, the center is everywhere. Or even better, we could say that here, the image of the center is that location which comes from time to time to be occupied by the theoros, by the histor. This idea that the Mediterranean center is everywhere, but then not just anywhere, is one that resonates with my own experience of the sea. Cacciari specifies that the sea's shifting points of focus, historically and in the present, act as hosts for what he calls the theoros and the histor. In ancient Greece, the theoroi would be individuals who have been assigned by their city-states to follow religious activity elsewhere and to bear witness to what the oracle had to disclose. In this sense, Cacciari argues that what shapes the shifting center of the sea is precisely the activity of those who have seen, who have witnessed and observed, and therefore who know and are well placed to attest the theoroi. Attestation here is a key word for the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is to me a sea of attestation, one whose history is shaped by many forms of witnessing, of bearing witness to spaces, to memories, to events. Paul Ricoeur would go a step further to call it attestation protestation, a position that would place us in a situation of responsibility in regard to history, to memory, to the event itself. The question to me here becomes, and this is a question that really and truly blights any effort to depict the Mediterranean in whichever way today. The question becomes one of answerability. Towards which aspects or facets of this incredibly layered region should we be answerable, or should we remain answerable? Some years ago, I found myself leaving the island volcano of Stromboli in the Aeolian Islands during the small hours of one July morning. Having just spent 3 or 4 hours on anchor in a little swaying boat. A gozzo, eyes glued into my binoculars in the hope of witnessing one of the volcano's famed eruptions, I finally gave up. As I headed back to Lipari, I turned around to place the binoculars back in my rucksack. And there, rising ominously above the pitch-black sea, was Stromboli, waving me off with the magnificent flare-up I had been promised at the Biglietteria the evening before. In its own strange way, this incident gave me an object lesson. The need for throwing out or jettisoning my plans and my own subjectivity outwards towards an exterior place or a situation that I never did envisage in the first place. Amid these islands, our demands and expectations often come to be overwritten or determined by the eventfulness of the sea, and by the eventfulness of the sea as a space that forces our psyche outwards, that makes us, to use Ian Chambers' words, vulnerable to encounters we do not necessarily control. Writing from the island of Corsica, Barbara Cassan described this status as being in an EX hyphen condition. She notes that the words exilio or exalto mean at once to leap up into the air, to spring out of something, to exalt or jump for joy, but also that their derivatives exilium or exolium point in turn towards exile, banishment. One is exul patriae, proscribed from one's homeland, exul mentis, deprived of reason. And the whole etymology refers to exolum, to what is hors sol, outside or removed from the land. I sense that here Cassan is touching on the paradoxical nature of another question. From which location, through which status, therefore, should we endeavor to pitch our thinking or our activity? In my case, my Mediterranean has become meaningful by way of looking outwards as a means of hosting other stories inwards, into my own writing. Over the decades, I have sustained an interest in those across the sea who, in Marina Warner's words, are marked by the stuff they are bearing with them in their heads when everything else has gone. This is how I'd like to start wrapping up this presentation. To speak of a Mediterranean mode of writing our lives is to navigate those ways of reattaching oneself to a place that is not home but must become one, as Warner puts it. To be somehow cast out of the field or right onto the high sea, to be at sea, inevitably creates occasion for the writing of memory. And this remains one of the main reasons why memory practice constitutes such a massive share of the ways in which cultural expression happens in our Mediterranean today. To look out for the anxious ways in which the stories of others beckon at us or ask us for a hearing. This is also a way of building our own voices. This has been my own experience as a practicing poet, and I'd like here to return to Hisham Matar, whose work I referred to at the beginning of this class. During his 1-month-long stay in the Tuscan city of Siena, following his frustrated quest after the whereabouts of his abducted father, who was abducted in Egypt. His father formed part of the Libyan opposition and he was abducted in Egypt in the early 80s. Matar sets up the city of Siena, with its wealth of art from the Sienese school, as a space that should be able to absorb those hopes which had already suffered estrangement within his own story and his own thwarted consciousness, the desire for good government, the triumph of justice, the demise of tyranny and obscurantism. In Siena, Matar hopes that the historic Sienese Republic may readjust its artistic resources and make of them tools towards a contemporary republic, one that may house the values that were refused to him as he searched for his father in previous years. Matar's memoir left me with a raft of questions lingering in its wake. What forceful quality of experience is such as to compel writers of memory to actively choose the space that is to host them or receive them? Does the authority to host an account of memory, to host the story of a memory, arise as a choice of its author, or does it emerge as a quality of the receiving space itself? And does the act of choosing the space that is to host someone, the act of pronouncing one's own zone of hospitality, does it change something within the psychic nature of loss or of grief itself? Again, in his memory poem Requiem for Tricomo, an elegiac invocation of the town of his birth in the book The Wind Under My Lips, which you see on the left-hand side on the screen. Cypriot poet Stephanos Stephanidis writes, I quote, that in this silence I traveled with the name, laid my body out in the immensity of the earth, exposing it to oracles, looking for a special divination, voices saying, don't forget, let memory decompose. Today, Cathy shoots photos for the post-mortem to seize the lost house in my voice. Does it still breathe? This poem is, to me, a very Mediterranean poem, in the sense that it is a poem of attestation, in which Stephanides speaks from a crossroads of traces in time, of memory and of a lost cartography, of the bond with a vanishing ecology as much as a severed home space, of ancient rituals that infuse a present as troubled as it can be enchanted. In Stephanides' poem, the point of Cathy's photos is to seize the lost house in my voice. There is, of course, the reference here to the poet's own experience of the partition of Cyprus. But how can that reference to the lost house in the voice not alert us to that other short distance in the Mediterranean between the desire of poetry to listen and the region's map of stories in exile, of muffled voices, of lost or of seized homelands? In its harrowing evocation of that lost house in the voice, the poem is enacting a blending of perception and sensation across senses. It's a synesthesia, no? One that overruns the border, that scatters the historic wound across one of the world's most anxious lines of partition. Here, the wound flows suggestively through the poem's senses as much as its spaces. I should not want here to attempt any further insight. Suffice it to say that the writing of memory in the Mediterranean today continues to strive to legitimate forms of sensory experience across borders, to create solidarities of sound within and across poems, trying to make literary space a habitable and affectional one in and of itself. Okay, that's it on my part. Thank you.
Thank you immensely, Professor Bugeja. This was seriously edifying, like most wonderful, insightful, thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure there are lots of questions, lots of clapping for sure. Thank you very much. I followed you. I was in a trance and taking notes because like Kachari and the Chambers, I know, but some Marina Warner, I know, but some of the others, I admit that I have not looked into, and I am going to look into some of the other. Wow, so many clapping. Some of the other authors that you mentioned. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so I'd like to open the floor to questions, comments. Whoever would like to go first. There are a lot of thank yous for sure.
I'm a bit hoarse because I came down with a really bad cold.
No, the voice
But
was
I hope
was
it was
wonderful.
clear. And
It was
yeah.
very clear, and the content certainly very thought provoking. So is it? Oh, there's Maria, and I think there's Professor Nicoli too. Let's start with Maria. Maria Petrescu, Professor Petrescu, who teaches French studies at our department.
Thank you so much, Professor Bugeja. I was wondering, how do you see preservation of memory in postcolonial or witness writing in the context of multilingualism around the Mediterranean space?
Yeah, thank you, thank you, Professor Petrescu. Yeah, again, a very interesting, very interesting question. The Mediterranean is incredibly. I find it really sort of reductive to speak of these sort of major languages, including Arabic itself, when one considers that sailing around even just the Mediterranean littoral, the Mediterranean coast, one comes across so many different dialects, modes and ways of speaking that it's really head turning. I was recently in Cairo, and you realize that trying to speak the Maltese language or parts of the Maltese language in Cairo is a different experience entirely from trying to speak it in Beirut or in Tunis, for instance. Obviously, I mean, the argument of people like Chambers would be that it is precisely this immense richness and transversal diversity of languages and language practice that has been strategically repressed through the presence of the colonial powers in the Mediterranean. But I think now that is changing significantly. It's changing significantly in part because of the ease of communication across communities. It's changing significantly because of the presence of migrant communities in Southern Europe and elsewhere. It's changing significantly also because of literary practices, I would say, of creative practices more generally. I think one of the more understudied, if you want, aspects of language in the Mediterranean is precisely its point of contact with creative practices. Yeah. So I would say that it's a very, I mean, I don't want to argue historically about the existence of trans-Mediterranean languages. That is all there. And they were languages practiced by sailors and seafaring people, languages like Sabir, which was spoken at various points around the Mediterranean. Today, I think that, and this is why I refer to solidarities of sound. I end up at many literary festivals where people are reading their poems in their vernacular language, and other non-speakers of that language are equally engrossed and appreciating the sounds and taking in the soul of the language. So the Mediterranean is a site for encounter of languages in this sense, and a very intriguing one, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think there was a question by Professor Nicoli, if I got that right.
Well, I'm really having a bit of a problem formulating a question because I'm still kind of inebriated by the sort of erudite exuberance of this poetic narrative, this poetic journey. So my compliments to the professor for this very for this important. I found this a tremendous intertwining of evocative autobiographical elements together with very high critical acumen. So my compliments and thank you for it. If I have a question, since I enjoyed every bit, every word of this presentation, I do have a question, in fact, which is a bit of a self-serving question in the sense that I just finished writing an article on which I called Su navi per mari, which evokes, of course, Bocelli's famous song Con te partirò, and it's about memory and journey fuori e dentro la letteratura in terms of history, personal history, and literature. So I was just wondering, in this oceanic sea journey, what importance, what significance do you ascribe to ships? Because as I say, my writing, I speak a lot about ships as metaphors, actually as etching words onto the surface of the high ocean, of the high seas. as you mentioned. So I was wondering, is again, just from my own understanding, because you mentioned little about the idea of ships etching their destiny, or I'm talking about immigrant ships, um, etching the immigrant's destiny onto the sea. Um, if you attach any significance, any particular significance to that.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Nicoli. Yes, it is of course deeply significant, both in terms of these vessels that are traversing the Mediterranean shores and that we find very little of. I'm a literary scholar by training, but you find in terms of the literature of migration, and I'm speaking in very broad brushstrokes here. But in the literature of migration, I keep noticing that very often you find a lot of narratives of departure, or narratives of arrival, or narratives of return. But you find very little narratives of the journey itself, of the vessel itself, of what's going on the ship itself. These stories you would get from migrant individuals themselves, in situations where they would be prepared or willing to speak about the experience. But I doubt I've seen a few of these narratives. I doubt whether that kind of surely terrifying experience has been widely shared. I doubt it. I think these are experiences that would be shared in very intimate fora, but they must be very rich stories, incredibly rich stories. There is in Malta a narrative also of, as there is around Sicily, around Lampedusa, a narrative of shipwrecks, of sunken ships. So ships whose last geolocation on the radar is known and then disappear. That is also a very intriguing story. Um, and the way in which these wrecks at the bottom of the sea have also acquired ecological significance because of the ecosystems that have cultivated themselves onto them and around them. That is something that I also find very interesting. In regard to, I mean, the whole marine history of the Mediterranean from a historiographic point of view, it's as you very well know, a very wealthy one. I've been through a few maritime museums around the region. But to me, ships, and as you've realized, I've taken it from a very poetic perspective, the whole experience. But to me, ships also have a very existential significance, if you want. To me, they are primary emblems, not just of how the communities who used them transported their goods or transported themselves, but also of the kind of aspirations that communities have through these mobile vessels. Again, very recently I visited the Grand Egyptian Museum, and they have on exhibition the solar boat of the pharaoh Khufu. Uh, and again, I mean, the story there is one uh, of transportation of the soul into the afterlife. So to me, I mean, above and beyond the material history of ships crossing the Mediterranean, ships are also signifiers of desire, of imagination, of memory itself, of nostalgia, if you want, of a certain deep-seated sorrow. I mean, Orhan Pamuk, as he watches the ships sailing up and down the Bosphorus, is also gripped by a deep sense of melancholy, precisely because ships in some ways mirror the passage of time, and their movement has to do with temporality. A ship moves from the past into the present and into the future, if you want, by definition. Well, I mean, these are some brief flights of fancy, but this is what I think of when I think of the being and existence of ships and vessels in the Mediterranean. I was recently reading a bit about, I confess it's a subject I don't know well, but I was reading a bit about what happened before Christopher Columbus started his endeavor and his venture to cross westwards. And I came across various references to, because Columbus apparently was also consulting fishermen and sailors who had made various forays out into the open. And I found it really significant that there should probably be a whole pre-Columbian history there of venturing west in all sorts of ways, or attempting to venture west in all sorts of ways. And heaven knows how many vessels have their own history to tell in that sense. I also think of the ship, and I will stop here. I also think of the ship in terms of literally in terms of the ship of Theseus metaphor, no? They are living artifacts. They are living artifacts of memory, and they are palimpsests in this sense. The ship in itself is a living example of a history that is constantly overwriting itself through the experiences that it harbors, that it hosts, that it brings on board.
That's so interesting.
Thank you, Roberta. May I add something else?
Sure.
Yeah, the motif for melancholy also fascinated me, the way you put it. Now, I know that melancholy is different from nostalgia, and which I wrote a little bit, as Roberta also knows. In fact, she contributed to that. Now, I'm thinking of nostalgia in terms of almost the original meaning of it from the Greek, which was a bit of a pathology, in fact. Also in terms of the immigrant journey, which goes back to Ovid when he was exiled from Rome, and he's dealing with it with nostalgia. But melancholy, the way I see it, is quite different. And from the wonderful words you said about it, you also mentioned the Greek meaning of it, which brings it back to the womb, to the mother, and to a giver of life. And of course, when we think of life and givers of life, we think of water, of the sea. But my question is, I suppose more specifically, if I can put it well to you, is melancholy a feeling? I mean, does it evoke a sense of loss, as nostalgia does, or is it merely evocative of space and time? In terms of lack of space and lack of time. I mean, I see a sort of a fusion in here somewhere from what you said between space or lack of it and time. A forlorn time, some time past, which we're unable to regain. Does it have anything to do with that in your
Yes, certainly, and again, a very intriguing piece. So basically, I keep encountering accounts that pitch themselves as melancholy accounts, but they are really and truly personal stories of having lived in cities close to the sea. And these would be stories that pitch melancholy almost as an emotional language in itself. And as you're saying, it's clearly distinct from nostalgia in the sense that melancholy becomes a mode of expression in and of itself. Now, Orhan Pamuk has a very interesting description of it. He writes, this melancholy doesn't only paralyze us, it gives us poetic license to be paralyzed, right? It's, yeah, it's a sort of a way of, it becomes a way of wearing one's idiom and one's own mode of expression on one's sleeve. It is certainly patently different from nostalgia. There is historically, the genealogy of both melancholy and nostalgia has to do with sickness. I mean, you can trace it back to the Aristotelian melancholy, the black bile, and so on and so forth. But there is a correlation. And this is a very, at least I can describe it as a very Mediterranean thing. There is a correlation between feeling in a bad way, and in some ways exploiting that wistfulness or that French tristesse, no? In order to accomplish an artifact, literally out of it, be it a memoir, be it a text, an artifact of a living artifact of some kind. Théophile Gautier, for instance, refers to the French 19th century novelist. He visited Malta in 1851. He visited Malta in 1851, and he visited, I don't know how many of you have or haven't been to Malta, but if you've been to the Maltese Islands, you will have visited the co-cathedral of St. John in Valletta, the Temple of the Knights of St. John. But Gautier walks into the co-cathedral and he describes the experience as having been gripped by an inexorable sense of melancholy. But the kind of melancholy he felt there, this is the mid-19th century, was the melancholy coming from the passing of the Knights of St. John, the end or the demise of that ancien regime. Then he travels up to Istanbul, and that melancholy that he feels for the first time in his diary, for the first time in Valletta, in Malta, that melancholy in Istanbul becomes a fully fledged uh, elegy for the passing of the Ottoman Empire in many ways, and he begins to speak of the derelict and degenerating landscape, cityscape of Istanbul. And of course, I mean, there is an interaction there with tropes of the picturesque, of the decadent, and so on and so forth. But then melancholy comes to mean different things to different people. I mean, the Palestinians have a whole tradition of melancholy through resistance, if you want. Yes, so a very nuanced, I would say, a very nuanced, but the Mediterranean makes it a nuanced emotion because of all the potentialities from around the littoral. And this is why I said everyone pours their stories into the melancholic.
And I find it very curious always when I think about it that the great melancholic period, the par excellence, the poet of melancholy is the Romantic poet in the 19th century, and that comes right after the great age of reason, of illumination. That always strikes me as something. Is it because, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, is it because reason somehow erases the pastoral idea of our ability to go back to something which was virginal, pristine, beautiful, and that could be at the base of the melancholy, or as you seem to point out, is it just a fashion, like as we say in Italian, a corrente, a school that we have to go through, and then it passes like everything else?
Yeah, a very interesting one as well. I mean, there is the way in which the modernists, what's interesting here is the way in which the poetic modernists of the Mediterranean dealt with melancholy is as a way of overcoming the disenchantment with the romantic pastoral, sort of, or with the romantic idyll, or whatever you want to call it. But I think that eventually the modernists repurposed the melancholic trope as a form of disenchantment, sometimes of bourgeois disenchantment as well. But it is very significant that poets like, I would say, Giannis Ritsos in Greece, and poets like Eugenio Montale in Italy were experimenting with shifting the landscape or shifting the cityscape, the urban cityscape, onto the seabed, literally. So they are using the sea as a means of reconstructing the ideal city, if you want, by shifting it onto the seabed. I keep note of the instances I encounter when landscapes and cityscapes are pitched on the seabed. I mean, Italo Calvino gestures in some ways towards this as well. But to me, it's I don't know. It's a reframed form of uh, via naturaliter negativa, if you want. It's a reframed mode of that, with certainly with the poetic modernists. Even Seferis himself, there's an obsession with human activity and human understanding of the natural landscape that's happening in the depths of the sea.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'm just going to proceed and ask my question. And if there's somebody else, they can ask their own question afterwards. It's more of a pragmatic question, if you'll allow, Professor Bugeja. So the shift towards Mediterranean studies per se takes place pretty much in the early 90s, right? And the rise of this discipline and the way some other disciplines move towards it, including my own discipline, Italian studies. So now we teach courses about Black Italy, so to speak, which kind of explore what's happening in the Mediterranean. So there's certainly an emphasis on the role of the Mediterranean, on what it can offer. And yet, at the same time, we just saw, and here I'm going to be a little bit more political, we just saw in the European Parliament what's happening with the vote and with the obscene chanting, send them back. So mine is a kind of question which I know does not have an answer, but at the same time, how do we reconcile our attempt to put the Mediterranean at the center and to a certain extent succeeding in making this region take center stage again? But at the same time, how do we make this relevant on a bigger scale, on a pragmatic scale, and avoid the scenes we've just seen this week, which kind of make us feel, at least they make me feel, completely hopeless. Like, what is happening? Why is this happening when there's so much that we're doing which should make us go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think thank you for again a very intriguing question. History takes us back to its own patterns, if you want. They might not always be neat ones, and very often they're not. But migration itself is always going to be with us. It's not some human phenomenon that can be somehow
Stopped.
is stopped or eliminated. I mean, we were made to move and to be mobile and to shift our locations of living as human communities and as individuals. The same argument goes for the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is always going to be there, and it's never going to make a neat fit for what the whole erstwhile European edifice of power wants it to be. The, I'm a believer. I have to say this. I'm a believer in notions of intercultural dialogue, for instance. And I'm a believer in notions of Euro-Mediterranean exchange. I'm not prepared to dismiss those platforms which will allow for dialogue. But dialogue is precisely what is needed here. Dialogue is precisely what is needed here. I think one thing that the European Union is not doing well enough is the creation of actual material people to people occasions for dialogue across Southern Europe and the Mediterranean. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about this. I also think that the Mediterranean in many ways is bigger than Europe, right? It is a region that flanks three different continents. There is a wealth and diversity of cultural idioms, of modes of doing politics, of doing economy. Is there a space? There's a lot of space for promoting, I would say, the interaction of peoples across shores, but also what I keep calling intercultural literacy. How do we promote the readiness to listen to the other story? I keep telling my students, even a novella, even a 30-page novella can open up a whole world about the country in which that novella is situated in. You don't necessarily need to read a tourist brochure. Uh, I experience, funnily enough, one of those moments when I experience the sense of the Mediterranean most intensely is at poetry festivals. When an Arab poet is reading, or a Spanish poet is reading, or a Syrian poet is reading, and you have a multilingual audience sitting there, you could hear a pin drop. There's total silence, and you can feel that everyone is taking in not just what is being said, but the silent baggage of stories that lie beneath. So I think the most important way of promoting that which the Mediterranean represents, which is relation and relation across shores and across borders, is through encounter, is through human encounter. And our readiness to diversify, to keep diversifying our own position, the ground we stand on. There are too many fixed ideas about who we are in the Mediterranean, too many fixed ideas about who we are. And that is fertile ground for the far right. Should we expect positions that would encourage exclusivity from institutions out of which we expect better? No. I think there's a lot to be done here in terms of understanding how communities in North Africa understand the Mediterranean, how communities in the Near East and the Mashriq understand the Mediterranean. We can't reduce the question of North-South or Southern European, North African relations to a question of migrants trying to cross. That is very, very humanly significant, of course, and urgent, but it is only it is a symptom of something else. It is a symptom of something else. So to me, the question of how can Europe live up to its historic responsibilities in Africa and in the Middle East is a very current and important one. Is a very current and important one. And again, it's not just a question of throwing money at the situation. There's much deeper work than that needs to be done. And that deeper work will somehow involve more intensified human encounter. One thing I would love to see, for instance, is more exchange of students, for instance, of students, artists, practitioners, historians, philosophers across European, North African, Middle Eastern shores. You know it is the right way forward because when you get, let's say, even a couple of scholarships for Palestinian students in a European university, the kind of mileage and beautiful cultural capital that is created within that little opportunity is incredible, is immense. So imagine we managed to increase that in pragmatic terms, as you're saying. So yes, I think we should put more of our resources where our happiness should be.
May
In
I
this.
also add, like, I
Mhm.
totally agree with you. May I also add, we can start with our own disciplines, like Italian studies, according to nation. Let's move
Yeah, yeah.
transnationally and open up and kind of not live in our own silos as if there's only a nation and a literature produced by a nation, and that's where it all stops. I'm very, very keen on always expanding. Like, it's not just about a nation and its people. It's the interactions with everything that goes around. It's the history. It's how that history has influenced other peoples and interlaced the history of other peoples living around the area. So yes, I totally agree with you. But also, I think we need to start with our disciplines and stop being so
Sure.
territorial,
Sure.
as you started off in the beginning. The territorial aspect, I think, keeps being dominant in some cases. But thank you
Yeah, I
very
mean,
much, Professor. Mhm.
in Tunisia, for instance, the sense of interest in the Italian language and in Sicilian studies, for instance, that you find is incredible. Uh, this is just one example that I'm thinking off the cuff. But yeah, but there's a lot to be done in terms of a cross-disciplinary Mediterranean, uh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, and as you're saying, I mean, starting with our own departments, with our own disciplines, with our own individual projects, and talking to each other across these interests and disciplines is a good way, is a good point, a good starting point.
For sure. Thank you very much. More comments, I know we've gone horribly over time and everyone's time is precious, but if there's any one last question, one last comment, I don't see any hands. Oh, there's one last comment.
No,
Yes,
it's not a comment. It's just a, s- a, sub- a word of gratitude to Professor Bugeja for this wonderful, intriguing, and fascinating talk. Thank you very
it really
much.
was.
Thank you,
I have
Professor
to admit,
Nicole. Thank
it's
you
I'm
all.
always
It's a
organizing these
pleasure.
guest lectures, but this was one of my favorite, and I absolutely enjoyed this conversation. It was
No,
wonderful. Thank you
thank
so
you so
much.
much for having me and inviting me. I mean, it's always a pleasure and a joy to be able to
It's
share
a very
these.
important conversation, and I hope that all our students who are here from, again, different fields, right? So we have coming from different, from the same department, but from different areas of studies, that they understand the importance of this kind of interlacing, interweaving, because ultimately knowledge does not have boundaries and does not have silos. So thank you very much, everyone. I will
Thank you so much.
let everyone go, and one last thank you, huge, immense thank you to Professor Norbert Bugeja for joining us this morning from the Mediterranean Institute at the University of Malta. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Calcasanto.
Thank you.
Thank you,
We'll be in
everyone.
touch.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you.
Immense thank you.